I don't really know what to make of this, and I talk about it in the book and in the reports that went before the book, is that Tektōn, the word usually translated as carpenter, when they say Joseph was a carpenter and taught his trade to Jesus, that sort of thing. Tektōn is more like construction worker, somebody who is skilled in constructing buildings and things like that, structures, one might say, out of wood or stone. And what we do have in the Nazareth area is an unusually large number of stone quarries, small stone quarries.
Professor Ken Dark, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Life itself is full of questions, and we spend a large amount of time and resource trying to answer those questions. What questions were you seeking an answer to in order for you to write a book about the archaeology of Jesus Nazareth?
Well, it starts with an explanation of how I came to be working on this subject. People often assume that when I went to Nazareth, I was trying to find Jesus or find where Jesus lived or something like that. Actually, I was there to investigate the development of Nazareth as a pilgrimage site, a Christian pilgrimage site, from being a relatively small Jewish settlement to being a Christian pilgrimage site which became known throughout the Christian world. So how did that happen? When did that happen? And what were the implications of that for the surrounding landscape, for the non-Christians who were in the area? So that was what I was in Nazareth and its hinterland to do. And that's why I came to Nazareth in 2004 to start work on it. And so that's the background to what I was doing. It just happened that in doing an archaeological survey, we can talk about that in a moment, of the area outside Nazareth, the agricultural valley to its north, it really is cut off from the land to the south. The work that we were doing revealed a lot of material from the time of Jesus, as it were, from the early Roman period. And that, of course, in the Nazareth area, has implications that it wouldn't say in an English county. That's how I came to be working on the archaeology of Jesus Nazareth, as it were, in the beginning. And the work that I was doing on Nazareth and its hinterland was published as two very, very comprehensive academic books a couple of years ago. And then there was such public interest, television, print journalism, on the internet, and just in person, there was such public interest that I felt it necessary to write a popular account, as it were, a general account, which was intelligible to non-archaeologists. And that's where the latest book, Archaeology of Jesus Nazareth, came from. And that is meant to present all the results concerning the first century to the general public. There's a lot of results of my work that are actually related to later periods, the Byzantine period, and even the Crusader period, but they're not in Archaeology of Jesus Nazareth. That is focused on the first century.
Certainly from my point of view, when thinking about this subject, I only have a very, very small amount of knowledge when it comes to these sort of things. And my knowledge would sort of start around Emperor Constantine when he converted to Christianity and his mother, Helena, went on a pilgrimage to all of the holy sites. And she supposedly found the cross, past the nails of the cross, and the tomb. With modern archaeology now, with all of the data, do they agree that Helena's discoveries are accurate or not?
All I can say is that you knew a lot more than most people about Constantine the Great and Empress Helena before you got into this. So, in short, we do know a lot about the Constantinian period, the early 4th century, and about the pilgrimage sites, the Christian pilgrimage sites that emerged in that period. Some of them, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the one with Helena finding the cross, do seem to go back into the preceding centuries. And in fact, there's a very good case made by one of the world's leading archaeologists, Martin Biddle, who's now retired, professor of archaeology at Oxford, that the tomb that was identified as Jesus Christ's tomb at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was indeed the tomb that Jesus was buried in. Now, there's a complex argument, archaeological and historical, why that is probably the case. And so we can be reasonably confident about that pilgrimage site originating in a place that the early Christians at least thought was Jesus's actual tomb, and was a tomb of the 1st century. So it could have been. And without some kind of truly remarkable evidence, which we don't have, we can say no more. Archaeologically, we can just say, well, there's no reason why not. Now, a number of early Christian pilgrimage sites in the Holy Land may well go back to sites identified before the Constantinian period and seen as at or near, often near, where important biblical events took place. So in that sense, they are authentic early Christian sites. Whether all of them or any of them are the actual places is beyond the scope of archaeology to demonstrate, at least with current evidence.
Do you ever find it frustrating in your line of work that it's very difficult to get certain evidence, an absolute? It's like, well, probable doubt would suggest that such and such. Is that a frustration of yours, or is that part of the fun?
It's neither one nor the other, actually. It's just an aspect of the discipline. It's that one cannot deal in absolute certainties of interpretation in archaeology on most, very, very many occasions. There are sometimes where we can say for sure that something can be interpreted in such and such a way, but that is not generally true. It is generally true that the probabilities are in favour of a particular interpretation, and that other interpretations are less plausible. And so that's part and parcel of archaeology. So archaeology is a science, but it's not a science that can deliver absolute truth in most cases.
So, was Helena responsible for starting the Christian pilgrimage?
No, not a bit. Helena comes after the initial interest in places mentioned in the Gospels, places of Christian association. But what Helena does is give an imperial impetus to the whole pilgrimage movement, so to speak, and to those particular sites that she visits. And from the time of Constantine, we see Christian pilgrimage taking off, and Christian pilgrimage sites becoming much more elaborate and much more established within the landscape. So, yes, the imperial interest in pilgrimage was what made pilgrimage by the 5th and 6th centuries such a big thing and made some pilgrimage sites extremely elaborate. We see this in Nazareth, where a Western woman visited Nazareth in the 380s, generations after Helena. Helena didn't go to Nazareth. When Egeria visited, this Western woman visited Nazareth in the 380s, there really wasn't much to see that was structural at all. She visited a cave church, a cave used as a church, which had a well. She saw a garden and another well outside Nazareth that also had Christian associations. But there wasn't a lot to see. Fast forward 150 years, there were 2 massive, elaborately decorated churches sitting in the middle of Nazareth on those same pilgrimage sites. And another church, about which we know much less, outside Nazareth at Mary's Well, where Egeria's other well, as it were, was probably located. So, in that century and a half, pilgrimage had gone from something where someone showed you a cave, showed you a garden, showed you a well, to a situation where you would worship in a mosaic decorated church with towering above you with elaborately carved architectural ornaments, imported marble being used for the special church fittings, and doubtless all sorts of other grandeur. So it is a major transformation, but it's not the origins of Christian pilgrimage, but the massive development of Christian pilgrimage.
From caves and wells and gardens to elaborate churches just a century later, when you were in Nazareth in the 21st century, what is it that you have come across, and where are the fields of discovery in which you're investigating?
The first work I did, as I said earlier on, was in the hinterland of Nazareth, in this agricultural valley between Nazareth and a Roman town, now ruinous, called Sepphoris. Now, that valley had been very little archaeologically explored from the point of view of its Roman and Byzantine settlement. Such exploration as had taken place had, for the most part, not been published, at least not published in any usable detail. So we archaeologically surveyed that valley and found it was full of Roman period settlements which went on into the Byzantine period, but which showed an interesting contrast between their early Roman existence, their existence probably in the time of Jesus, and their Byzantine state of being, which reveals something quite profound about the cultural world of early Nazareth, and for that matter, Sepphoris. The settlements on the Sepphoris side of the valley, it's quite a broad valley. The settlements on the Sepphoris side of the valley are extremely similar to the material culture inside Sepphoris. That is to say, they have typical Roman provincial material culture, stuff coming in from all over the world, all over the Roman world, and yet somewhat of a local identity. On the Nazareth side, that all changes, and everything that was used, that we could find, was produced, we know from other sources, by Jewish craftspeople. It was material culture made for the Jewish population by other parts of the Jewish population. And everything that was outside of that Jewish cultural and religious world was seemingly excluded from the Nazareth side. Now, so what, you might say? That is the only place where we can see that so abruptly as a contrast between Roman provincial culture, which was pretty much all pervasive in the early Roman period, and local culture, indigenous, if you like, culture. Not just the only place we can see that in Israel, as it is now, but the only place we can see that so abruptly, so clear-cut in the whole Roman Empire. So that's a pretty striking contrast, and it is south of that divide, in the Nazareth area, of course, that we can see historical evidence for Jesus being a child and a young man. And so that casts really completely new light on the cultural world in which Jesus grew up. It was pretty much purely, and it would have had to be self-consciously, Jewish, as opposed to a mixture of Jewish and provincial Roman. So that was the first thing we did. The second thing was to try to understand the settlement of Nazareth itself. Now, some archaeological work had taken place by the Israel Antiquities Authority and by religiously motivated archaeologists, especially Franciscan archaeologists, who had done a major and extremely important excavation at the Church of the Annunciation, some people say Annunciation, in the centre of Nazareth. That today cathedral-size church is the focus for Christian activity in central Nazareth in the 21st century. But it goes back to a Crusader church, and below that, a Byzantine church, and below that, even what seems to be a late Roman church. And this is focused on early Roman, first century included, features of mostly agricultural installations and that sort of thing, cut into the natural limestone, effectively chalk, that made them visible even to the pre-21st century archaeological techniques which the Franciscan monks used. And they were, how can I put it, not really up to date with the archaeological techniques of their time in the 1950s and 60s and very early 70s, let alone the sort of methods we'd use today. Anyway, that piece of information and little snippets of archaeological information that the IAA, the Israel Antiquities Authority, had got from what we call rescue archaeology, archaeology ahead of construction or development of some kind, did enable one to piece together a little bit about first century Nazareth, and indeed a bit more about later Roman and Byzantine, and for that matter medieval Nazareth. But it really didn't give a very good picture of what Nazareth was like in the early Roman period at all. So we were, and we in this sense meant I, was looking for a site which I could excavate with the Israeli permissions and so forth, the landowner's permission as well, to elucidate what Nazareth had been like in the Roman, Byzantine, and medieval period. When I was doing that, there didn't seem to be many possible options. Nazareth today is a very built-up place. And what we did come across, I use we for the team, but I, in fact, did come across, was a previously excavated site at a place called the Sisters of Nazareth Convent, which the nuns themselves had excavated in the 19th and early 20th century. And they'd preserved the ruins they found, and to some extent the objects they found, in the convent, but had never published them in any proper way. And these ruins and objects were virtually, not entirely, but virtually unknown to scholarship. The only thing really that had become at all well known, even to specialists on early Roman archaeology in Galilee, where all this is situated, was one of the early Roman tombs, a very well preserved tomb at the Sisters of Nazareth site. But there was a huge amount more. And my work in Nazareth then became unraveling this sequence, bringing the earlier excavations to publication, and also adding to what was known about the site by modern archaeological survey and finds study that we could do without doing any new excavation. And we added quite a lot to what was known and managed to sort out the records and identify the objects, etc., that the nuns had recovered. So then I could bring this to publication and analyse it in so doing in a 21st century archaeological way. And that is what enabled me to then combine this information with those snippets that we already knew and build up a picture of Roman period, Byzantine, and to some extent medieval Nazareth. And it's the early Roman period bit of that which is presented for the general public in Archaeology of Jesus Nazareth.
Is it a frustration in a way that there's so much emphasis on the early Roman era and not the others? Or is that just the way the world goes with attention and eyeballs and the interest certainly around the character of Jesus?
Well, certainly, if one's working in Nazareth, one expects a certain amount of interest in Jesus' Nazareth. It's true to say that I was extremely pleased to actually find one of the lost pilgrimage churches of Byzantine Nazareth, which the nuns had excavated and not really realised what they'd got. They sort of realised that it was it, but they didn't have the archaeological knowledge and the comparative information that we do now to understand it properly. And that church, what is called by modern scholars the Church of the Nutrition, not that anybody in the Byzantine period called it that, was built over what the Byzantines believed was the house where Jesus had been brought up. Now, when I realised what we'd got, the Church of the Nutrition, it would be true to say that I was pretty sceptical as to whether we would find a first century house under it. But amazingly enough, preserved in its crypt, there was a well-preserved house or structure, let's say, from the 1st century, associated with domestic material, which could be interpreted on normal archaeological grounds as a domestic building, if you like, a house. Now, you can play with various specific interpretations of the house and reconstruct it in various ways, but it does seem to be a domestic building. So the Byzantines were probably right in saying that their church was built over a 1st century domestic building, a 1st century house. What archaeology can't tell you is whether that house had anything whatsoever to do with Jesus, Mary, or Joseph. But then it comes down to looking at the anthropology of memory and memory studies in general, and whether communities can remember significant buildings over hundreds of years. The first Christian building, as in the sense of a building constructed for Christian worship at the site, seems to be no later than the 4th century. So no later than the period we were just talking about, of the Constantinian period. And that is a cave church, and that is constructed in the hillside right next to the house, but not destroying any part of the house. So it would be within the bounds of normal archaeological interpretation to say that this was a site Christians were probably venerating from that early 4th century period, if not before. So we have evidence of Christian veneration of the site, and strangely enough, there are very, very few wells in central Nazareth, but that there is one at the Sisters of Nazareth site. And that brings me back to that Western woman, Egeria, writing in the 380s about a cave church with a well in the center of Nazareth. And that may very well be the Sisters of Nazareth cave church that she's writing. She then in the late 4th century, already believed that the place that the cave church was, as she put it, the house of Mary. So there is the real possibility that local people remembered the 1st century house as being something to do with Jesus. That's, anthropologically speaking, in terms of the comparative anthropology of memory, specifically the way in which communities remember places, actually not that unusual in terms of people remembering a locally significant place. Bear in mind, they don't have to be Christians remembering that was a house associated with Jesus, because Jesus must have been in the mid-Roman period, probably in the early Roman period as well, by far the most well-known person who'd ever come from Nazareth. So, those ruins over there, they were the house that Jesus lived in, is not an implausible thing for a Roman period villager to sort of say. But whether they did, that's another question. So my view has always been, public view and stated in many, many interviews over the last decade and more, has always been that there is no archaeological reason why the Byzantines should have been incorrect. But on the other hand, we can't say that this was the house of Jesus. There have been many people, there are many people who would make much bolder claims about what has become quite widely known in my experience as Jesus' house, or the house of Jesus is usually the term that I get said to.
When I first came across it, I don't really know what I imagined in my head, but I was somewhat surprised given how rocky it obviously is. And certainly Nazareth is surrounded a very rocky area. Jesus himself even said, build your house upon a rock.
Yeah.
Do you think that's related to, obviously this is speculation, but do you think that might be related to the house in which he potentially may not have, or maybe did?
Again, I've never said this myself, but when we were working on the site, as well as professional archaeologists, we had a number of volunteers, and the very archaeologically interested university chaplain at my then university, who, to be fair to him, was a medieval historian before he was a clergyman, and later went on to get a doctorate in archaeology and history, said to me exactly what you've just said. Wherever Jesus lived in Nazareth, the house he'd have lived in would have been built on rock, because Nazareth is a rocky place, and it contrasts in many ways. Maybe it's why Nazareth was in its exact location. It contrasts with the rich agricultural land of the valley. So the valley is unusually fertile in Middle Eastern terms, let alone local terms, and that's obviously why it could support so many settlements in the Roman period. You know, the farming settlements. What is really, I think, really intriguing, and I don't really know what to make of this, and I talk about it in the book, and in the reports that went before the book, is that Tektōn, the word usually translated as carpenter, when they say Joseph was a carpenter and taught his trade to Jesus, that sort of thing. That Tektōn is more like construction worker, somebody who is skilled in constructing buildings and things like that, structures, one might say, out of wood or stone. And what we do have in the Nazareth area, which, as I say, I talk about in the book, is an unusually large number of stone quarries, small stone quarries. Now, there's a cluster of them around Sepphoris. Well, you'd imagine there would be, because a large Roman town needs a lot of stone for its buildings. But what's the cluster? There's an equivalent cluster around Nazareth. What's that doing there? You know, it looks as if Nazareth was producing way more stone, or quarrying, that is, way more stone than it actually needed for its own constructional purposes. So, given that elsewhere in the Roman Empire there are settlements which are primarily agricultural, but have a kind of sideline of quarrying, which archaeologists imaginatively call quarry settlements, we like to, give very direct descriptions of things. It is what it says on the can type stuff. And given that there are these quarry settlements, couldn't early Roman Nazareth be a quarry settlement in that sense, primarily agricultural, but a bit of quarrying on the side. I think that's quite likely. That's not a biblically inspired, as it were, interpretation or textually derived interpretation. That is a straightforward archaeological interpretation that you might make of the same combination of archaeological characteristics, I don't know, anywhere in the Roman Empire, in if you rather than in Galilee. So, right, if we have a quarry settlement, possibly, and someone described as a Tektōn, then it is not beyond the bounds of possibility that Jesus and Joseph actually were involved in that. Frankly, probably most people, most adults at least, in Nazareth, if it was a quarry settlement, would have been involved in that. So again, that's not exactly an outlandish, theologically relevant. Well, it might be theologically relevant, but theologically inferred comment, and that things like that do present a new context for the Gospel's description of Jesus being in Nazareth. That is really where I would say I can see my archaeological work being used by biblical specialists. And I know that many biblical studies scholars do use this work now. But that's not my motivation. That's not my own avenue of interpretation of it.
It's interesting the use of the word Tektōn. So in Luke chapter 2, there is a passage about Jesus as a child, and as a family they go to the temple, and Mary and Joseph then leave and go home, but then they realize that they left Jesus in the temple when he's about 12 years old. And then Jesus goes on to say, well, I'm about my Father's business, inferring that he's doing the work of God the Father and not the father of Joseph. However, he then does go to do the work of his father Joseph, which is the Tektōn, as you say. It's interesting in Mark, it says, is this not the Tektōn? Whereas in Matthew it says, is this not the son of the Tektōn? So it was in Matthew scrubbing him up a little bit.
Yeah.
But if Tektōn can mean two different things, and that Nazareth is such a rocky area, where did we get this Jesus, the wood carpenter, idea from that populated the art world for the whole of, forever?
Yeah. Well, several sources for this. Of course, Tektōn can mean a carpenter. So that's not a mistranslation. Also, to be honest, Galilee, and including the Nazareth area, is known to have been a lot more wooded in the early Roman period, and indeed the Roman and Byzantine periods, than it is today. It wasn't until the Ottoman period, centuries later, that most of the timber in Galilee was cleared away. So, in parts of it. So, it's not that Galilee was a mass of dense forests, but there were little woods and not so little woods, which people could cut down trees out of and use. And we see this in terms of timber used in buildings. We see this in terms of resources from these woods being used through the centuries. Evidence, as you can imagine, gets better the later you go on. Tektōn, meaning carpenter, could be the right translation. It could be somebody who did both stone carving and carpentry. That would be possible as well. But I think the problem, as in many interpretations that have gained currency about the Bible, and I'm not a biblical scholar, but I do know a little of ancient languages, is, as in any text, there are translations that, while not mistranslations as such, are translations of words giving one meaning of the word, whereas there could be others. And this seems to me something that translations of the Bible have been affected by, but also, frankly, translations of most ancient texts. So the Bible is not uniquely given to mistranslation or anything. And, various translations can lead to various different interpretations. But fortunately, archaeological evidence isn't prone to exactly that, but it can be interpreted in different ways. So, for example, in the Sisters of Nazareth site, the first century structure, the domestic structure, can be interpreted as a courtyard house, a more complex form of Jewish first century domestic building associated with an extended family, essentially a courtyard in the sense of being buildings grouped around an open space. Or it can be interpreted as a simple rock-cut dwelling. And to be honest, when I was writing the more formal scientific report on the Sisters of Nazareth site, I thought the courtyard house interpretation was preferable. But since then, I've changed my mind slightly and think that though that one is possible, the simple rock-cut dwelling interpretation is also pretty much equally possible. So you pay your money and take your choice. Consider for a moment the view of those who interpret this literally as Jesus' childhood home. It would affect how one viewed Jesus' childhood, whether he lived in a relatively comfortable, sorry, that wasn't a hand gesture, that was a fly, a relatively comfortable courtyard house, or a very simple rock-cut dwelling. One would say the courtyard house would not be a wealthy building. I mean, that courtyard house is used in various forms, in various meanings in Roman archaeology. One meaning elsewhere in the empire is that it is quite a wealthy type of house. But in the Archaeology of Galilee, we would use courtyard house usually in terms of this still lower status but extended family dwelling. So none of this means that Jesus was a posh person, but it might mean that he was from what one might call an ordinary rural Galilean background, the courtyard house, or from quite a poor background, the simple rock-cut dwelling.
If we look to the canonical Gospels, for example, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they don't say much about Jesus' youth apart from the bit in Luke 2 that we said. And there's the infancy Gospel of Thomas, but that's been all but really rejected. And we don't know much really from a theological point of view about Jesus' youth. So from an archaeological point of view, what were the findings of the investigation in which you posed about Jesus's house or a similar house to that?
Well, first I should say that my friend and colleague Joan Taylor, Professor Joan Taylor, at King's College London, the university I'm attached to at the moment, is writing a book called Boy Jesus about Jesus's childhood from primarily textual sources, using archaeological evidence, including my evidence, as part of that, but primarily looking at textual sources. And I think that involves a reconsideration of just how much we can authentically know, or know with some degree of probability about Jesus's childhood. So that will be out, I think, in 2025, and I can't possibly talk about the conclusions, etc. here. That's for you to interview Joan. I'm sure I'll be happy to talk. But that will cast new light on Jesus's childhood, as through particularly the perspective of texts. So far as I'm concerned, archaeology can tell us quite a bit about what it would have been like growing up in Nazareth, even from the data we already have. So we have evidence that it's an agricultural community, a deeply religious Jewish community following Jewish religious law, hence all the exclusion of Roman provincial artifacts. Not an impoverished community. There's no evidence that it's especially impoverished compared to other rural Jewish villages of its time. Not necessarily an especially poor place, but not necessarily an especially small place either. We just don't know, in the light of what I was saying, how big Nazareth was when Jesus was living there. It could have been anywhere between a hamlet, which is what it's usually described as by archaeologists, on really, in my opinion, no good evidence, to a large village, which is equally plausible. But the courtyard house, if that's what it is, the Sisters of Nazareth, and there is another house from early first century Nazareth, just across the modern road from the Sisters of Nazareth, at the International Marian Centre, the ecumenical Christian centre. That house is also what might be classified as a Galilean courtyard house. So if those are both courtyard houses, they suggest a somewhat larger settlement than a hamlet. The Galilean courtyard houses, though rural, domestic family houses, do indicate slightly larger communities. So that's what I would say about that. We can see crafts working in early Roman Nazareth, agriculture, quite a lot of agriculture, quite a lot of agricultural installations found at the Church of the Annunciation, which, in my opinion, and the opinion of some of my archaeological colleagues, might indicate a centralized crop processing function for surrounding settlements. So you can imagine people coming to Nazareth from all those villages in the valley, at least on the Nazareth side of the valley. So maybe on market days, or I don't know, religious festivals, if they were a different time, maybe they could be the same days, we would have more people in Nazareth than on a typical work day, as it were. So one would expect there to be religious services held with religious orientated Jewish inhabitants of Nazareth. You would expect them to be engaging in collective worship in some way. I'm trying to carefully avoid saying going to a synagogue, because although there are first century synagogues in the sense of buildings, we now know archaeologically, whether someone like Nazareth would have had an actual synagogue building begs the question of how large it was, and might be for all sorts of other variables which we frankly don't understand. But it could have had a synagogue building. It could, as Jody Magnus, the American, I think she would say, biblical archaeologist, has pointed out to me, have a synagogue that was a religious assembly outdoors, or potentially even in a building used for other purposes in daily life. So we can say there would have been a religious assembly there, but not necessarily a synagogue building, but there could have been. And so we can build up a picture of Jewish law and the Jewish calendar governing the sort of rhythm of the year, agricultural seasons, and the need to plant crops, harvest, etc., also affecting the rhythm of the year. Obviously, family life, creating a community in which there were people of different ages, craftspeople, as well as pure farmers. Obviously, the stoneworkers or quarry people, who were probably the same as the farmers, but doing these activities at different times of the year. And it's been suggested by another biblical scholar that it would have been quite a young community. He, a chap called Greg Jenks, has drawn attention to the fact that the anthropology and comparative historical evidence of village communities in the Middle East suggests that one would be looking at a younger community in age profile than we might imagine, not least because of limited longevity, but also people taking on what one might call adult roles at a younger age than we would think of. We're talking work here, crafts working, the child helping their mother or father, I don't know, in the carpentry workshop perhaps, but spinning, grinding corn. There are watchtowers, agricultural watchtowers in Nazareth, well, in the area around early Roman Nazareth that have been excavated. Those were for people to watch out for predators, animals in the fields. So one can imagine that while the fully grown adults were working on the fields or in the fields, the kids might have been put up in the watchtowers to keep watch. And so there are many, many things that we can say about the Nazareth that Jesus would have grown up in. And I try to say these things in Archaeology of Jesus Nazareth. And in fact, at the end of the book, I try to give a list of things that we can say pretty firmly, mostly from archaeology, but some of them textually, but mostly from archaeology, about what it would be like to live in early first century Nazareth.
Just as a final, not very serious question, Ken, the whole BC AD thing, why do we still use those terms given that most of the historical or archaeological work completed is secular?
Well, we use those terms as conventional terms of the Western calendar, and as traditional, conventional terms, they are much more useful, much more acceptable than some of the alternatives that have been proposed. So, for example, some particularly American scholars use CE, meaning AD, the Common Era, and BCE, before the Common Era. But these terms effectively just mean AD and BC. And frankly, as a non-Christian student of mine explained to me politely but emphatically, only Christians and perhaps Jews would consider the Common Era as being the birth of Jesus onward. And so his opinion was it was less offensive to his beliefs to talk about AD and BC, because he could accept those were traditional Western terms, than BCE and CE, which implied that this was the Common Era for everybody, or before the Common Era. And in that way, many of these terms that have been suggested, that is the most widely used, especially in US academia. And probably as a result of that, one sees it often in Israel also. But in mainstream archaeology, most archaeologists, certainly in Europe and Britain and Ireland and what the Americans would call the Old World, would use the AD BC terminology. I mean, I was at the International Roman Archaeology Conference earlier this year, and though there were some people using CE and BCE, pretty much the majority were using the AD BC system, and frankly, I see no reason myself to change that.
Professor Ken Dark, thank you for your time. Thank you for explaining and expanding the amazing work of which you have done over decades. I really appreciate you taking time out to come and talk about all things archaeology on the podcast.
Thank you very much.